Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the birth of a cultural force that pretty much defines our modern world, the teenager.
When I say the word teenager, what pops into your head? If you're thinking rock and roll, leather jackets, the 1950s, you're not alone. But guess what? The real story starts way earlier.
Yep, you heard that right. The whole idea of youth as its own separate, rebellious, and powerful stage of life, it was actually forged over a super volatile 70-year period that we're about to unpack. This wasn't some sudden pop culture explosion. Oh no. This was a slow, dramatic invention.
All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to cover how the teenager was first invented. Then we'll look at the very first rebels and the absolute panic they caused. We'll see how adults tried to define and control them, and then explore how war, jazz, and the Great Depression threw gasoline on the fire, leading to the teenager we know today.
Think about it. Before the late 1800s, life was pretty straightforward. You were a child, and then, boom, you were an adult worker. There wasn't really any in-between to speak of. But big changes, industrialization, cities booming, were about to change all that, creating a brand new social category right out of thin air.
So this whole journey kicks off around 1875. You start seeing the first signs of it in private diaries and public scandals. By 1904, science gets involved and the term adolescence is coined, basically defining youth as this unique, stormy period. Then, massive global events like World War I and the Roaring '20s hit the fast-forward button on everything. And it all leads up to 1945, when the teenager finally arrives as a fully formed identity, especially in America.
So, who were the poster children for this new rebellious spirit? Well, right from the get-go, this new idea of youth split into two archetypes that, honestly, still fascinate and scare us today: the dreamer and the delinquent.
On one side, you have the dreamer. Meet Marie Bashkirtsev. She's a 14-year-old Russian aristocrat in the 1870s, and she completely rejected the quiet, domestic life she was supposed to lead. Instead, she filled her diary with these incredible ambitions, writing, "I dream of celebrity, of fame." She wanted a public life, a life of achievement, a life that, back then, was only for men.
And on the other side, you have the delinquent. This is Jesse Pomeroy, the so-called boy fiend of Boston. In 1874, his horrific crimes, which included attacking and murdering other children, absolutely terrified the public. It sparked this huge moral panic. People didn't see him as a kid who'd gone wrong. They called him a young demon. And this is the key takeaway here. This new youth identity was immediately a battlefield. You had the Bohemian path, artists like Arthur Rimbaud who just said no thanks to society's rules and chose creative chaos instead. And then you had the gang member path, where kids in the slums of New York and London made their own rules for style, honor, and just plain survival.
So naturally, as these youth subcultures started bubbling up, what did the adult world do? Well, it freaked out. It scrambled to understand, to define, and, let's be honest, to control this totally unpredictable new force. They kind of created the problem, and then they tried to solve it.
Psychology was their first tool. In 1904, a psychologist named G. Stanley Hall officially defined adolescence. He called it this turbulent, storm-filled phase of life between 14 and 24. His description? A period of mental and moral drunkenness. He basically framed being a rebellious teen as a kind of temporary insanity that everyone just had to get through.
The wider reaction really came in three flavors. First, you had social reformers like Jane Addams, who created settlement houses to try and teach middle-class values to poor kids. Second, the law got involved, creating the world's first juvenile court in Chicago to handle newfangled crimes like incorrigibility. And third, you guessed it, the mass media fanned the flames with scary stories about youth gangs and the evil influence of cheap books and movies.
And that new justice system? Man, it got busy fast. In its very first year, that Chicago juvenile court saw 1,500 cases. And get this, the charges weren't just for stealing. They were for really vague stuff like wandering the street and disobeying parents. It shows the system wasn't just fighting crime, it was trying to criminalize the very act of being an independent kid.
So, things are already bubbling, right? But now,
A series of global crises are about to come along and just accelerate this whole evolution at a dizzying speed, pushing youth in completely different directions all over the world.
First up, the Great War. A whole generation of young Europeans were sent off to die by their elders. This created a gap, a canyon, really, of cynicism and anger that just couldn't be bridged. The ones who came back, they saw the adult world with total distrust. This was the birth of the lost generation.
But then came the Roaring '20s. In America, which was shielded from the worst of the war, youth culture just exploded. You had dance crazes, speakeasies, new freedoms. Older folks called it a new pagan world. This is the moment youth became synonymous with pleasure, with being modern, with rebellion.
But that party, it came to a screeching halt. The Great Depression pulled the rug out from under millions of young people. In the U.S. alone, more than 200,000 became wandering hobos, just riding trains looking for work or food. For a whole generation, the choice was stark: despair or a turn to radical politics.
And in Europe, that radical turn became terrifying. Movements like the Hitler Youth took all that youthful energy and weaponized it. They promised purpose and power to a lost generation. But here, rebellion wasn't channeled into freedom, it was channeled into total submission to a brutal state-run ideology.
And this all brings us to 1945. After 70 years of this wild ride of rebellion, control, and chaos, the teenager had finally officially arrived. But what that word meant was totally different depending on which side of the Atlantic you were standing on.
And this contrast is everything. In America, the teenager was born as a consumer, a market. They had their own slang, their own music, swing, and their own magazines like 17, which launched specifically to sell them stuff. Meanwhile, in Europe, youth meant being a survivor. They were resistance fighters, like the members of the White Rose, or even child soldiers. One youth was defined by consumption, the other by trauma.
So by the end of the war, all the pieces were finally in place in America. The teenager was now a distinct identity. They were a target for advertising, a consumer of music, fashion, and magazines, a cultural force defined by high school life. This was the birth of an ideal of optimism and consumption that was about to be exported to the entire world.
So the 70-year battle of rebellion, control, and commerce is what forged the modern teenager. Its legacy is incredibly complicated. It's a mix of freedom and conformity, creativity, and commercialism. So the next time you think about youth culture, just remember, it wasn't just born. It was invented through a long, fascinating, and often dark struggle that continues to shape every single one of us. How does that complicated legacy define our world today?